Honorable Prime Minister, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to everyone who has joined us for the RIGSS Friday Forum today. While we have many of the registered participants within Bhutan, we have also quite a few of you tuning in from other parts of the world. I would like to welcome each one of you to the forum, and I have no doubt you will find the talk this afternoon enlightening. A special note of welcome to all the LKY school alumni in Bhutan who are with us today, including the Honorable Home Minister, Limpo Ugindorji. We are indeed very happy to get this opportunity to listen to our Dean once again. We are extremely delighted to be able to present the RIGSS Friday Forum Eminent Speaker Series in a virtual format starting this edition. And we are indeed deeply honored to have none other than Professor Kishore Mahbubani as the speaker for today. We had the pleasure of having Professor at our institute 8 years ago in October 2014, when he delivered a thought-provoking Friday Forum lecture on the topic, Asia in Today's World. The subject that Professor has chosen to speak on today, which is, can small states survive, is indeed something very close to our hearts, and one that certainly merits wider discourse, particularly in light of the latest developments around the world. As provocative as it may sound, the topic already makes one reflect. And for the Bhutanese audience, I must say, it does sound very familiar. Indeed, our survival and success as a nation has been at the core of every royal address His Majesty the King has delivered to the nation. Professor will be speaking for about 30-35 minutes, after which we will have the Q&A session. To ask questions later, you may just raise your hands electronically or type in your questions in the chat box. Alternatively, you can also send in your questions through the Slido, and we will ask them for you. The Slido event code is 3019565, as you can see on the screen. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, kindly allow me now to say a few words about our speaker, Professor Kishore Mahbubani. Professor Mahbubani is a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Center, Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore. He has had two distinguished and distinct careers in diplomacy from 1971 to 2004, and in academia from 2004 to 2019. He is a prolific writer and a much sought after speaker around the world. In diplomacy, he was with the Singapore Foreign Service for 33 years. He had postings in Cambodia, Malaysia, Washington, DC, and New York, where he twice was Singapore's ambassador to the UN and served as president of the UN Security Council in 2001 and 2002. He was permanent secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore, from 1993 to 1998. As a result of his excellent performance in his diplomatic career, he was conferred the Public Administration Medal Gold by the Singapore government in 1998. Professor Mahbubani joined academia in 2004 when he was appointed the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. He was dean from 2004 to 2017 and a professor in the practice of public policy from 2006 to 2019. In April 2019, he was elected as honorary international member to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which has honored distinguished thinkers, including several of America's founding fathers since 1780. Professor Mahbubani is a prolific writer and has written several books, including Can Asians Think?, The New Asian Hemisphere, The Great Convergence, Can Singapore Survive?, Has the West Lost It?, and Has China Won?, among others. Professor Mahbubani has received significant international recognition for his many accomplishments. He was listed as one of the top 100 public intellectuals in the world by Foreign Policy and Prospect magazines in September 2005, and included in the March 2009 Financial Times list of top 50 individuals who could shape the debate on the future of capitalism. He was also selected as one of foreign policy's top global thinkers in 2010 and 2011. And in 2011, he was described as the muse of the Asian century. He was selected by Prospect magazine as one of the top 50 world thinkers for 2014. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is indeed a very brief introduction of Professor Kishore Mahbubani, considering all that he has been able to accomplish in his life thus far. Professor, we welcome you once again to the RIGSS Friday Forum. Over to you now, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chawang. I hope that you can hear me.
Very clearly, Professor.
Okay, good. Let me begin by saying, Honorable Prime Minister, distinguished guests, alumni of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, friends. I want to begin by saying that I'm very, very happy that I can see you all and join you again for this event, because I think many of you know one of my favorite countries in the world is Bhutan, and my wife and I cherish the memories that we've had of the visits to your country and the remarkably generous hospitality of the government and of the people of Bhutan towards us. And as soon as the world opens up again fully, we would love to come back to Bhutan, and I would love to give this lecture in person when I arrive in Bhutan. Now, the reason why I chose this topic, can small states survive, is that the answer was, of course, always yes. But what's different today is that I thought, and I may have been naive, that for small states, that over time, as humanity became more civilized, that the world was becoming safer and safer for small states. Sadly, I actually believe that the world is now getting more dangerous for small states. So this is why I think all small states should take a step back and reflect on what has been happened recently and consider the implications for themselves. So I want to, therefore, the way I'll structure my remarks is that I divide my remarks at three levels: the global, regional, and national level. At the global level, I want to sort of talk about how the recent developments in Ukraine have made the world a dangerous place. And then at the regional level, I will talk about the implications of Ukraine for our region, especially, frankly, for the biggest geopolitical contest that will affect our region, all of Asia, which is, of course, the US-China contest, which will also have implications for the India-China contest. And then finally, I'll talk about what we can do at the national level to help us prepare for this more dangerous world. So let me begin by talking about the war in Ukraine. And here I want to emphasize that when future historians write about this war in Ukraine, they will actually be quite shocked that this war happened despite the many warnings that were given to all the states in Europe, all of them. And you know, the European Union states, member states, claim to be the most advanced states in the world. And in many ways, the European states are the most advanced states in the world. They enjoy a standard of living, a quality of life that very few in the rest of the world enjoy. In fact, frankly, few other societies are as well functioning and as socially just as contemporary European societies. We should still look up to them as models for socio-economic development. And yet these advanced states have, in a sense, been geopolitically stupid. And I use the word stupid very clearly because they have ignored the warnings that were given to the European states over the past 25 years. And again, if you want to get evidence for what I say, I want to mention that a few months ago, I had the great honor of receiving an honorary doctorate from the Macau University of Science and Technology. And when I received the honorary doctorate, I gave a 1-hour ambassadorial lecture. I think it should be available at my website. If not, I'll be happy to send a copy to Chawang. And I spent 1 whole hour, can you believe it? 1 whole hour listing down all the warnings that have been given since 1997, which is 25 years ago, about the dangers of expanding NATO eastwards. And you know, at that time, probably one of the 2 greatest living strategic thinkers that the United States had was a man called George Kennan. Now, George Kennan, of course, will always be regarded as one of the greatest Americans because he was the one who formulated the containment policy against the Soviet Union way back in the 1940s. And of course, at the end of the day, his containment policy succeeded. And at the end of the day, United States won the Cold War against the Soviet Union by following the long-term strategic advice of George Kennan. Now, one would have thought that after the Americans had benefited from getting the good advice of George Kennan in the Cold War, they would then listen to him on how to deal with Russia, right? Because George Kennan is a specialist on Russia. And George Kennan explicitly said in 1997, he said, you must not expand NATO because by expanding NATO, you are insulting, you are humiliating Russia. And he said the reaction will be very, very bad. And of course, the Russians will get very angry and the consequences will be negative. Now, as you all know, starting from the 2000s, the warnings of George Kennan were ignored. And of course, initially, NATO began expanding into the Warsaw Pact states and subsequently went further and threatened to invade territories of the former Soviet Union, including Ukraine and Georgia. And I want to mention that there was in particular a NATO statement in 2008 at a time when President Bush was the president of the United States, and NATO states, including the advanced European states, including Germany, including France, including Italy, including Spain, agreed to open the doors to NATO for Ukraine and Georgia. And of course, Kennan had warned that this would create an angry reaction, and this would lead to incredibly negative consequences. Unfortunately, all these warnings were ignored. Now, and I hope if you get a chance, have a look at the lecture that I gave in March this year, because you will see how many warnings were given. And if possible, also, you can go onto YouTube and listen to a lecture by Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago. His lecture has been viewed 29 million times. And it's a 2015 lecture he gave, again, warnings of the dangers of NATO expansion. Now, I want to mention all this because traditionally, it should be the more advanced states that would have learned how to manage the difficult geopolitics of post-Cold War Europe. And unfortunately, the more advanced states didn't manage it well. And that's how you have this war in Ukraine. Now, I want to emphasize one important fact. When someone tries to explain the causes of the war in Ukraine. An explanation is not a justification, right? Because the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal. It violates international law. It goes against the UN Charter. And therefore, it is right for the international community to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, you know, in geopolitics, you do not just moralize, you must analyze. And wars are like cancer. If you want to prevent cancer, you don't just moralize, you don't just say cancer is bad. You try to find out what causes cancer. So for example, we now know that smoking causes lung cancer. So we tell people don't smoke. If you smoke, you may get lung cancer. So similarly, in many ways, George Kennan was warning. He said expansion of NATO will lead to a backlash, will lead to conflict, will lead to war. And all the warnings were ignored. So therefore, we must make sure that we understand the deeper causes of what is happening behind Ukraine. Now, all this now brings me to part 2 of my lecture, and what are the implications of Ukraine for the rest of the world? And unfortunately, Ukraine is going to mean that the US, see, the primary geopolitical contest in the world is not going to be between the United States and Russia. United States is far more powerful than Russia. In fact, the US economy is at least 10 times the size of the Russian economy. So there's no contest there. But the main geopolitical contest in our world today will be between United States, between the world's #1 power, which is United States, and the world's #1 emerging power, which today is China. And I've written about this geopolitical contest in my book as China Won, which I believe is available in Bhutan too. And that will be the contest that will drive world history. Now, when I wrote the book, I was hoping that my goal in writing the book was to try and reduce the prospect of this geopolitical contest disrupting the world. Now, after Ukraine, the likelihood is that the US-China contest will gain momentum. Now, why do I say that? Because in many ways, the United States wasn't sure for a while whether it would get sufficient international backing in the contest against China. But one of the consequences of the war in Ukraine is that the United States and Europe have now become much closer, and you have a much stronger Western alliance. And therefore, the war in Ukraine has been a win for the United States and a loss for China. In geopolitical terms, win for United States, loss for China. And so now the United States therefore feels stronger and more self-confident, and therefore will step up its efforts to stop China from becoming #1. And I can assure you, I was in Davos 3 weeks ago, and I was actually in Venice last week attending meetings where we were discussing US-China relations. And I can say with great confidence that I have absolutely no doubt that the US-China geopolitical contest will gain momentum over the next 5 to 10 years. And of course, when a geopolitical contest between the two most powerful countries in the world, US and China, gains momentum and becomes worse, it will be a more difficult geopolitical environment for everyone in the world, including small states like Bhutan, like Singapore. So we should therefore prepare ourselves for harsher times coming. And of course, we can discuss what is driving this contest. If you read my book, I talk about the three structural forces that are driving this contest. I won't have time to go into it here. I'll just mention the three structural forces. One is, of course, the first is the iron law of geopolitics, which is that whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, the world's number one power always pushes down the world's number two power or the world's number one emerging power. So the United States is behaving according to a law of geopolitics that is actually over 2,000 years old. So what the United States is doing in trying to stop China is normal behavior. And then, of course, the second structural force, which no one talks about, is what I call the fear of the yellow peril, which exists in the Western imagination. And I only want to mention it because, you know, a lot of the reactions of the United States to China are emotional and not rational. And if you want to understand why this emotional reaction comes from, it's of course comes from the fear of the yellow peril too, which no one in the West speaks about. And number three, of course, as you know, many people in the United States also believe that there is an ideological contest between the United States and China. And I think President Joe Biden has been quite open and honest about this. He says, in the world today, we have a contest within democracies and autocracies. By that, he means the democracy like United States and an autocracy like China. So unfortunately, I wish I had some good news for you on that front, but I don't have good news for you on the US-China front. I'm going to add another dimension, which I can't go into great detail again, that this also has implications for another geopolitical contest, which is that between India and China. And I think for a state like Bhutan, which has got two big neighbors, China and India, that you have no choice but to monitor very carefully what's happening on the India-China front. And I can tell you that if I was giving this lecture before June 2020, 2 years ago exactly, I would have been optimistic that India-China relations would improve over time. As you know, after the clash at the border in June 2020, relations between China and India have gone down. And the question is, what happens in the future to China-India relations? And my sense is that as of now, they are stabilizing for whatever reason, again, for complex reasons. Now, while India was moving closer to the United States, in some ways, the war in Ukraine has created problems within India and the US and India and the West. And the United States is not happy that India has not condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The United States is not happy that India is still buying weapons from Russia. The United States is not happy that India is now buying cheap oil from Russia. So you can see how it is a contest that India didn't start. India didn't get involved in the Ukraine issue, but India is being affected. So all this, of course, then means that India is also looking for other options for itself. And therefore, to some extent, this may actually help to stabilize the China-India relations a bit. So you can see when you have a geopolitical event, it has consequences all around the world and affects other relationships, including the India-China relationship. So therefore, we have to follow what's happening on the global geopolitical front because it has implications for all of us in all dimensions. And we can talk about other dimensions too. So what does this all mean for small states? And now let me turn to part 3 of my remarks, and I spent a bit of time down there on the part 3 of my remarks. I want to emphasize that small states who should always be paranoid about the future should become even more paranoid. Because in many ways, what's happened is that if a widely predicted war, like the Ukraine war, can happen, despite all the warnings that were given, it shows that wars can happen anywhere. And so we must therefore be more vigilant than we have been in the past about the prospects of war. And the best way to be vigilant is to strengthen the country as much as possible. So small countries cannot afford to be divided. Small countries cannot afford not to have a united population that is working together to keep the state together. And that, as you know, has been the belief of the founding fathers of Singapore since Singapore was founded in 1965, 57 years ago. So it's very important that we enhance this sense of vigilance. And the way to enhance this sense of vigilance for small states, and I would mention 3 things that are important for small states to do. The first thing, of course, is to explain to the population why the small states always have a deep sense of vulnerability. And it's very important to emphasize this, that small states cannot believe that they can be secure and rest assured of security. They cannot. They cannot be sure of security. Because remember, at the end of the day, Ukraine, in theory, is not a small state. Ukraine actually has 40 million people. 40 million people, yet a country of 40 million people has now been dragged into a major war, right? And as you know, the people of Ukraine are suffering enormously as a result of this war. So if a country of 40 million people can be invaded, you can imagine what about a country like Singapore, which only has a population of 5 million people. So therefore, it's important for small states to have a deep sense of vulnerability about the future and not believe that they can be secure. And at the same time, as you develop among the citizens a sense of vulnerability, which then hopefully creates a sense of national unity, at the same time as doing that, it's also very important for small states to develop their institutions, especially the institutions of the civil service. And in some ways, you would say, well, we just need the civil service to ensure that all the public services work, to ensure that we get electricity, to ensure that we have hospitals, to ensure that we have schools, to ensure that we have a post office delivering letters. But actually, these institutions do not just provide services, they are also an indicator of the health and well-being of a society. So a well-run society, therefore, is a strong society. And therefore, this is the reason why we must pay attention and develop strong institutions, because they are like, in some ways, like, in a human body, you must have a strong heart, you must have good lungs, So all these, just like you need the vital organs of a body to perform well, you also need the vital organs of the state, like in the civil service, to perform well. Now, as you know, for those of you who are graduates of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, you know that I always give a lecture to every student who enrolls in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and I give to them the secrets of Singapore's success, and I explain why Singapore has done well over the years. And as you know, I try to boil down the secret sauce of Singapore into a very simple, memorable acronym called MPH. Now, MPH doesn't stand for miles per hour, which is what most people think it stands for. MPH stands for three things that explain Singapore's success. M stands for meritocracy, P stands for pragmatism, H stands for honesty. And frankly, after the Ukraine war, I think MPH has become even more important to small states. And so in terms of M is meritocracy, means that it's very important that a society finds its best people to work in the public services. That has been a cornerstone of Singapore's development. And one reason why, for example, the Singapore government gives out scholarships to the best students in primary school, the best students in secondary school, the best students in universities, is to ensure that the best minds in Singapore develop. And when you're given a scholarship by the Singapore government, you are then obliged to work for the Singapore government for 5 or 8 years. And in the process, the government is able to assess whether the person is suitable for the public service, and then he or she is nurtured and kept in the public service. So it is not a natural thing for the best brains to go and work in the public service. In fact, in many countries, like for example, in the United States of America, I can assure you, the best minds don't go to work in the public service, whereas in Singapore, the best minds go to work in the public service. A great state like the United States can afford to have public services that don't perform well, and frankly, the public services in the United States, in many states, are now performing very badly. A great state like the United States can live with that. It doesn't weaken the United States. But for a small state, it is terrible to have weakened public service institutions. And so a very strong, conscious effort must be made to inject the best people into the public service, because if you don't have the best people in public service, then a small state cannot be strong, cannot be resilient, and cannot perform well. And I want to add as an aside, in case you're wondering, how is it you make sure that you promote the best people? How does it you make sure that you end up with the best people staying on rather than the best people leaving? There are various methods that have been worked out in many countries around the world. And I'll give you a simple example. Now, I was a member of the Singapore Administrative Service of Singapore for 33 years. And I can tell you that when I was permanent secretary of the Foreign Ministry of Singapore, once a year, I would go to a very important meeting with all the other permanent secretaries of all the ministries. And this meeting was important because we would have about 200 or 300 people in the top level of the civil service. It's called the administrative service. And every year, the 10 to 15 permanent secretaries would have to do what is called a forced ranking. A forced ranking means that we have all the 200 names in the admin service or 300 names in the administrative service, and we rank them number 1 to number 200 in terms of potential, not in terms of performance, okay? In terms of potential, what is the potential of that person? What is the highest level he or she can reach? Now, this is a very cruel exercise. A forced ranking exercise is a very cruel exercise because you're forced to say that somebody is number 1 and somebody is number 200. You must decide who's number 1, who's 200, and you go down the list. And this is many people avoid doing this because it's cruel. You're basically saying that somebody is much worse than somebody else, right? It seems like a cruel thing to do. But at the end of the day, by being very ruthless and cruel in assessing people, you ensure that only the best people get selected and sent to the top. And so the people who are ranked very highly in terms of potential are promoted faster and are given positions of responsibility. And therefore, in Singapore is the only public service in the world, I think, where often your boss is younger than you. It's happened to me in my career too. I had bosses younger than me because their potential was higher and they were promoted faster than me. And so that is something that has worked in Singapore. And Singapore did not invent this, by the way. Everything that Singapore did, as you know, Singapore copied from other countries and learned from other countries. So frankly, if Bhutan wants to develop the world's best public service, it can be done, but you sometimes have to be cruel and brutal and do things which are painful. But by doing them, you ensure that you end up with a public service that is among the best in the world. And it is very important to do that. So that's all that is part of what I call the meritocracy. Pragmatism, of course, means that you learn as much as you can from other countries. And in fact, it was Mr. Deng Xiaoping who famously gave the best explanation of pragmatism. He said, it doesn't matter if a cat is black, if a cat is white. If it catches mice, it is a good cat. And Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter. We can learn from the West. We can learn from the East. We can do whatever is necessary. And that's the reason why China has been so successful. China has been the most successful country, major country over the last 30, 40 years by being very pragmatic. For China to succeed, it's very important that China remain pragmatic and adapt best practices from other countries. But to my surprise, even though China's zero COVID policy worked very well in the years 2020, 2021, enabled China to develop very well, in the year 2022, the zero COVID policy of China is not working well against Omicron. But you notice that China is having great difficulties turning around to adapt to a different environment. Now, it's actually quite dangerous certainly for small states not to adapt to change circumstances. I think to some extent it may be dangerous for China also, but that's why I wrote an article in the South China Morning Post calling on China to change its approach towards zero COVID and open up vaccinate the old people in China faster and open up the country. It can be done. Now, I explained that to you because what's amazing is that even a country like China, which is a very successful country that has always been pragmatic, has in some areas stopped becoming pragmatic. And it's a big state like China can live with that. But for small states, we must always be pragmatic. We must always adapt. We must always change and never stick to policies whenever they stop working. And that's why pragmatism is important. And finally, of course, the third word is H, which is honesty, which is the most important of the three. And you have to ensure that you have an honest public service if you're going to succeed in whatever you're doing. And that's what basically gives Singapore a competitive edge over most countries in the world, because we have one of the most honest public services in the world. And that's not easy to achieve, but when you achieve it, it really makes a huge, huge difference. So the last point I'm going to make, and I've exceeded my 30 minutes already, I'm going to conclude and then listen. I look forward to answering your question. The last point I'm going to make is that at the end of the day, the societies that survive are the societies where the people have a strong set of values, the right values. They believe in the country. They believe that they're serving a good cause by working for the country, and they believe that the country is fair to them. And so as a result of it, you get a virtuous circle, and you have people who have integrity, who are committed to the country, and who are willing to, work and die for that country. So developing a good set of national values is very, very important. And here I would say Bhutan is a lucky country, because my experience of Bhutan is that the Bhutanese have a very strong sense of national identity. In some ways, I think the Bhutanese sense of national identity is stronger than the Singaporean sense of national identity, because Singaporean sense of national identity is still very new. It was basically created by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and the first government from 1965 onwards. It's only 57 years old. But Bhutan's sense of national identity is much older, deeper. But it's very important, again, not to take this sense of national identity for granted. It's very important to keep on strengthening the sense of national identity of these people. So when people talk about development, when people talk about how to ensure small states survive, sometimes they just pay attention to the tangible factors. How fast is your economy growing? How many exports you have? How many imports you have? Those are all the tangible things you can measure. But what is equally important, if not more important, are the intangible factors of development and the sense of national identity, the sense of national resilience of that country. And it's very important, therefore, for small states to pay attention to the tangible things like the strong public service institutions that I spoke about, but it's also important to pay attention to the intangible factors and to measure in one way or another these intangible factors to see whether the sense of national identity is becoming stronger or becoming weaker. And as you know, in some countries, it is getting stronger. In some countries, it is getting weaker. It's a fact. So therefore, having this sense of national identity is also very, very critical. And a sense of national unity is critical, especially for small states if they want to survive. So I hope I haven't alarmed you too much in my remarks, but I do want to, in a sense, end with a very clear statement that the world is getting more dangerous for small states, but nonetheless, we can still survive if we pay attention to some fundamental points along the lines that I have presented today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for that very enlightening, enriching, informative talk. We will now open for the Q&A session. We have until at least 3:45 for the questions. So as mentioned earlier, those of you on screen, you may just raise your hands electronically or type in your questions in the chat box. Those who are outside the screen, you may send in your questions through Slido. The Slido event code is 3019565. As I see the Honorable Home Minister, Wimbo. Please go ahead.
Very good afternoon, Professor. I am Ugindoji, Home Minister of Bhutan. And it's good to see you after 5 long years. Alumnus of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, graduated in 2017, Master of Public Policy. And I am very glad to see you in sound health, Professor, and to be able to listen to your talk after such a long time. I think I missed your talk, and I'm happy that I could attend this talk today. Your overview of the geopolitical events around the world and in the region are very comprehensive and very enlightening. But I wanted to ask a question that is related to the national institutions that you drew our attention to, and that is really with regard to the civil service. I fully agree with the need to strengthen the institution of civil service, for civil service to be pragmatic, for civil service to be honest, and for civil service to be meritocratic. But I was also wondering with regard to the role of the elected politicians like myself, because in a democratic setup, elections do come after 5 years. And then when governments change after every 5 years, then the learning curve of the politicians basically starts from the ground zero. And all said and done, the role of the politicians are also very important, the elected leaders. Despite the strong bureaucracy, the civil service that may be in place. So my question in this regard is, how do you ensure that we do get the breed of politicians that are also equally meritocratic, honest, and pragmatic, and especially with regard to the deficit in terms of the experience that the bureaucrats might have? How do the institution of bureaucracy and the elected leaders interact in order to deliver the kind of development that the country envisioned to deliver for its progress and development for a longer term? So that, in short, is my question, Professor. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm very, very happy to meet an alumnus of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And I'm very happy to meet a successful alumnus of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And I congratulate you on your appointment as Home Minister of Bhutan. And you're absolutely right about one point. Developing good public servants requires one set of skills. Developing politicians require a different set of skills. And so it's important to be clear. And I wanted to focus initially only on the public servants. Now, when it comes to politicians, you know, many people used to think that the easiest form of government is to have a democracy. Because in a democracy, at the end of the day, the people decide, and if there's good government, you get the people vote you in again. If there's bad government, people vote you out. So it's okay. Democracies will naturally succeed. But actually, what history teaches us since the days of Plato is that democracies are designed to fail. Now, this is something no one in the West will tell you, by the way. That if you set up a democracy, you're not creating a system that is designed for success. You're creating a system that is designed for failure. And the reason I say this is because most politicians, to get elected, will say things to make the people happy instead of saying or doing things that would be good for the country necessarily. So for example, politicians will say, if you elect me, I will cut your taxes, right? Now that may be good in terms of the individual paying less, but it's bad for the country. Because small countries actually need to collect taxes and need to get the taxes paid. So paradoxically, for a long time, and if you think I'm exaggerating that democracies are designed to fail, I would encourage you to look at chapter 7 of my book, Has China Won? Because in many ways, you know, the gold standard of democracy used to be provided by United States of America, right? But the United States of America today is not an example of a good democracy. It's an example of a bad democracy. Because the United States of America has become, sadly, I mean, I say this as a friend of the United States, has become a plutocracy. What is a plutocracy? Now, a democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people, right? So a government of the 100%, by the 100%, for the 100%, because all people choose the government. In a plutocracy, it's a government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. And so all the decisions that are made by the US Congress and Senate are decisions that help the 1% and do not help the remaining bottom 50%. In fact, the United States is the only country where the bottom 50% has seen their standard of living go down over the last 30 years. Now, I say all this because it's very important that now that Bhutan is a fully functioning democracy, I think the politicians should be aware of the dangers of populism, right? Populism is when you tell the people what you think will make them happy, rather than tell the people what will make the country strong. right? And the reason why Singapore succeeded is because we had an unusual leader like Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who saw that his job was not to feed candies to the people, but actually to give them bitter medicine and to tell them the hard truths about how you develop. And success in life, as you know, doesn't come from doing nothing. Success in life comes from struggle and sacrifice, right? And you know, there is no politician in the United States of America that will tell the people, if you elect me, I'll make you struggle, I'll make you sacrifice, but 30 years from now, we will become much stronger. But this is what Singapore did. So it's therefore, it's in the field of politics, it's very important that all politicians be aware of the dangers of populism, and therefore, in a sense, spend some time telling the people that to succeed, nothing is going to fall from the sky. We all have to work hard. We all have to struggle hard. And I would say, therefore, the politicians in Bhutan should look for success stories from development like Singapore, right? Or frankly, like Switzerland, or like, Sweden, and so on and so forth, and look for the failures in democracy. And unfortunately, the United States has become, in some ways, a failure as a democracy. And I actually, for that reason, feel quite pessimistic for the United States, because there are very few politicians willing to tell the American people the hard truths for what the United States needs to do. So I think, therefore, my short answer to your question is that politicians in Bhutan should study success stories in democracy and should study failures of democracy and ensure that the failures of democracy are not repeated in Bhutan also. And to be always aware that having a democratic form of government is actually a very difficult form of government to have. I hope I didn't depress you too much with your answer.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor, I have a few questions on Slido here. Let me take this up, which is related to honesty in public service, which you highlighted. The person asked, you mentioned that Singapore has one of the most honest public service in the world. How is that measured? Has it got to do with corruption?
Absolutely. In an honest public service, you have no corruption. And of course, when Singapore became independent in 1965, the salaries of Singapore public servants were among the lowest in the world, and therefore there was a lot of corruption. But by a historical accident, Singapore has succeeded for many reasons, but sometimes luck is also a factor. And Singapore was lucky that the first set of leaders that we got, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, Lim Kim San, Hon Swee Sen, they were all honest people, and they didn't take any money. So if leaders at the top are honest, then they can implement honesty. And I can tell you that the first leaders of Singapore were brutal about corruption. So there was a case of a minister of state, like a deputy minister in Singapore, was invited by his businessman friend to take a holiday overseas. And at that time, the salaries were low. So the minister of state says, I have no money to go on holiday. So the businessman said, don't worry, I'll pay all your expenses. So this businessman, this minister of state went on a holiday. And when he came back, he was arrested for accepting a free gift from a businessman. So even though he didn't give any favors in return, he was arrested. So when a deputy minister is arrested for accepting a gift, everybody gets a message and people stop taking gifts. In fact, when I worked in the public service in Singapore, anytime somebody gave me something, I had to report the gift that was given and pay for that gift. So when I once went to see the richest man in Asia, Mr. Li Ka-sheng, and after he gave me a generous $100 million donation for the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, he also gave me a wonderful Mont Blanc pen. And I had to go back and pay $500 to keep the pen. So I got it as a gift, but I had to pay $500 to keep the gift. You know, so therefore, having very strict rules about not accepting gifts and about not accepting any favors from anybody is what I call a measure of an honest public service, one where there's no corruption. And I think my point is that it can be done. And it all depends on remember earlier on I spoke about the importance of values. It's very important that if you have the right set of values, then people will not become corrupt. So it can be done.
Thank you, Professor. While our audience on the screen think of the questions, there are more questions here. One related question. How did Singapore government manage the transition to meritocracy in the public service? Was there or were there any negative implications in the beginning?
Well, there was definitely a lot of resistance in the beginning to the transformation of the public service. Because, as you know, Singapore actually inherited a reasonably good public service from the British government. Singapore was a British colony, just like Bhutan in some ways. And we were lucky that the British set up a reasonably good public service system in Singapore. But it was a non-meritocratic system. In the British public service system, to get promoted, you must serve time. You must serve 10 years. So for example, if you join the foreign service, you had to work diplomatic service, you had to work 10 to 15 years as a first secretary, and then you get promoted as a counselor after 10 years, and then minister counselor after 10 years, and then you become ambassador. So you have to be at least 55 years old before you can become an ambassador. But in Singapore, I became an ambassador at the age of 35 because it didn't have to wait 10 years to get promoted. If you did a good job, you got promoted faster. So we changed we took a British public service and we turned it around. And so what we did instead, when I mentioned the idea of forced ranking of the public servants, which is cold and brutal and difficult, we got that idea from a private sector company called Shell. So in private sector, the companies believe you should promote the best people because the best people deliver the best profits to the company. So in most countries, the public service learn best practices from other public services. In Singapore, the public service has learned best practices from the private sector also. So we took private sector practices and put it into the public service. Now, of course, many civil servants protested. They said, how can somebody younger than me be promoted faster than me? We said, well, it depends on your potential and your performance. So therefore, there was some resistance in the beginning, but over time, when people saw the results and the results were good, and of course, if you promote good people and you get good results, people are happy and therefore they accept those changes. And so Singapore is the one country in the world which doesn't believe in seniority in the public service. I hope that answered. There was resistance, but we overcame it.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. There are so many related questions, but let me, for a change, go to a question related to geopolitics. What strategies can Bhutan adopt to navigate the China-India rivalry? Now, this is the question asked by someone, Slido. What strategies can Bhutan adopt to navigate the China-India rivalry? Do we stick with the status quo, meaning leaning towards India or be more open to China?
Well, I would say it would be safer to stick with the status quo. If you change, you might upset countries. If you change anything, if you move closer to China, you will upset India. And if you move closer to India from where you are, you might upset China. So I think if the status quo has worked for Bhutan, I would keep the status quo for a while. I mean, maybe 10, 15 years from now, you may want to change, but not now. Because now is a dangerous time for change. Because since everybody is feeling insecure with all these changes, it is better to keep your status quo. So for example, Bhutan, I know, has a good relationship with India, and it should preserve that good relationship with India. It's very important because India is much, much more powerful than all the other countries in South Asia combined. Much more powerful. So it is, and since India is now cooperating well with several of its neighbors, including Bhutan, Bhutan should continue cooperating well with India. But at the same time, I know you don't have official diplomatic relations with China, but I think you do have unofficial encounters in many places. I would keep up the unofficial encounters with Chinese diplomats and with Chinese leaders, just to keep on assuring them that Bhutan is not anti-China. I think, you know, I can tell you that this is an important point, during the Cold War, Singapore was closer to the United States, right? And the Singapore at that time was suppressing the Communist Party of Singapore at home, right? But even though Singapore was anti-communist at home, I went with Mr. Rajaratnam, the foreign minister, to Moscow in 1976. This is a long time ago, okay? And I went with him, and Mr. Rajaratnam sent a message to the Soviet Union. He said, we are close to the United States, but we're not anti-Soviet Union. We want to have friendly ties with the Soviet Union also. And it's interesting, Singapore is so far away, you know, from the Soviet Union. You see, unlike you have a border with China. We don't have a border with the Soviet Union. But even though we had no border with the Soviet Union, our foreign minister flew all the way to Moscow to tell the Soviet Union, we're not your enemy. We're not opposed to you. And in fact, we will work with the Soviet Union. We will trade with the Soviet Union. And indeed, I can tell you that we told the Soviet Union that we welcome US, American naval vessels to stop for refueling at the Singapore port. We also welcome Soviet vessels for refueling at the Singapore port. So you can see that even though we were much closer to the United States, we made an effort to reach out to the Soviet Union. So in the same way, Bhutan is of course much closer to India than it is to China. It'd be good to send messages out that Bhutan is not anti-China and can work with China wherever necessary. And so that is the balance that I would maintain. And so I would say keep the status quo and don't do, in the next 10 years, things will be very dangerous. Don't do anything different in this particular area. It's the most sensitive area in Bhutan's policies.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight, Professor. For our audience on the screen, anyone, any questions? You may raise your hands or just speak in. I don't see anyone right now. We have more questions here on Slido. Professor, somebody asked, how should small states balance its priorities among bilateral, regional, and multilateral forums, and how can each be used to strengthen small states?
Well, I would say that small states should be aware that they're very small and not join too many forums. there's a danger of small states being stretched if they participate in too many international forums and too many international gatherings. They can be very exhausting for small states. So you should be very careful and very selective about which forums that you join as a small state. And certainly, it's very important to be represented in the key global multilateral bodies. So the first priority must be to have a strong presence at the United Nations in New York and in Geneva. You must support global multilateral institutions because they're important for small states. And it is the UN Charter that protects small states like Bhutan, like Singapore. Secondly, of course, you should join the forums that are important to your neighbors. So, for example, the forums that are important to India and your South Asian neighbors, like SAARC, you should pay a lot of attention to and work within SAARC to, in fact, try to strengthen SAARC. Of course, SAARC is handicapped by the fact that India and Pakistan don't have a normal relationship. So SAARC is the opposite of ASEAN. ASEAN, as you know, is the second most successful regional organization in the world after the European Union. And I think Bhutan can encourage SAARC to learn lessons from ASEAN, to send delegations to ASEAN to understand why is ASEAN so much more successful than SAARC in regional cooperation. And I can tell you that the ASEAN has developed very, very well. Let me give you one statistic so that Bhutanese can understand how well ASEAN has done. Now, in the year 2000, Japan's economy was 8 times bigger than ASEAN's economy in the year 2000. Now, Japan's economy is only 1.5 times bigger than ASEAN. From Japan's economy from 8 times bigger, only 1.5 times bigger. And now, within 10 years, ASEAN will be bigger than Japan. It's an amazing success story. The 670 million people in ASEAN have done very well in development. And indeed, we trade much more with the rest of the world, and ASEAN has now become the #1 trading partner for China, overtaking United States, overtaking European Union. And that's amazing. So it shows you that you can have successful practices. So I would say that it's very important for SAARC to learn lessons from ASEAN. And that's one thing that Bhutan can try to encourage, but you got to do it delicately because India may not be happy about learning lessons from ASEAN, but you can gradually persuade India that maybe SAARC can be improved and develop more trade within SAARC. So I would say focus on the global institutions and the regional institutions, and also whatever cooperation pacts you have with your neighbors, focus on those also. But don't join too many multilateral organizations, because if you don't have many people, they should be spending time on domestic development and not attending a lot of meetings overseas.
Thank you, Professor. The Honorable Prime Minister has a question. Mijay.
RIGSS and Dr. Song, thank you for this wonderful discussion, I would say, Professor Kishore. We have not met, but I've listened to your talks a couple of times, be it live or on YouTube. So I'm very happy to be talking to you, even though virtually. Very, very frank views, thought-provoking. Thank you very much. My question would be on geopolitics, as you have started off with. What are the Ukraine-specific factors that resulted in the war, other than their eye on being NATO member or the EU trading? Other than the obvious ones, what are the Ukraine-specific factors that resulted in the war?
Well, you will find, by the way, thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister, for attending the talk. I'm greatly honored by your presence. The Ukraine war, as you know, is still carrying on. And sometimes when you are in the middle of a storm, you still do not know what really happened. You'll have to find, maybe when after the war ends, you'll find out the real results. But it's very, very, number one, the most important reason why this war has happened is that Ukraine and Ukraine's neighbors, European neighbors, ignored the warnings about expanding NATO. And Russia was very, very clear. Russia drew a red line and said, we cannot allow Ukraine to join NATO. And by the way, what Russia did, and if you listen to John Yesheimer, the same thing would be true for the United States too. If tomorrow Mexico decides to sign a defense treaty with China, United States will object. United States will not allow it. But you know, the United States has got something called the Monroe Doctrine, that no hostile power can establish a presence in the region. And you saw that's what the Cuban Missile Crisis was all about. The Soviet Union wanted to plant nuclear missiles in Cuba, and the United States said, no, you cannot do that, right? Even though Cuba is a sovereign country. So in many ways, when Russia says that a neighbor should not join a hostile pact, it is behaving exactly like the United States, or frankly, like any other great power. I will not accept a hostile power in my neighborhood. And you know, this is also true. Recently, you notice that Australia got very upset when Solomon Islands, a small country, signed a pact with China. And United States objected. And Australia objected. So you can see it's the same rule everywhere. So that's the first and most fundamental reason why this war happened. Secondly, this is something nobody talks about. The government in Ukraine was weak. The government in Ukraine was also one of the most corrupt governments in the world. You know, Transparency International has got a list of the corrupt governments in the world. Russia is ranked very low, 116 out of 180 or 190. But Ukraine is ranked even lower at 140. So when you have a dysfunctional government, a corrupt government, so the government wasn't strong and disciplined enough. Of course, what has surprised everybody is that since the war began, President Zelensky has proven to be a good leader. He has rallied his people to fight the Russian invasion. But before the war, it did not appear as though Ukraine had some strong leaders. So I would say the weak government in Ukraine, the corruption in Ukraine was also a factor. The third factor I would point to is and these are being very blunt here, the cowardice of the European Union states. And the European Union states, Germany and France, knew very, very well that admitting Ukraine into NATO will be a slap in the face for Russia. They knew that. So therefore, Germany and France should have said, no, we cannot admit Ukraine into NATO. And if they had vetoed it, there would have been no war in Ukraine. But in the year 2008, before President George W. Bush stepped down, he pushed very hard, not him, actually, he was surrounded by advisors who were neocons, neoconservatives. And these neocons insisted on putting in the NATO statement a sentence that says NATO will be open to admitting Ukraine and Georgia. And the Europeans knew that this would make Russia very angry. But they should have vetoed it. They should have stopped it. But unfortunately, the European states were either cowardly or reluctant to do the right thing. And as a result of that, that's another factor that has caused the Ukraine war. But the real tragedy about the Ukraine war is that this has been one of the most avoidable wars. Because if Ukraine had agreed to stay out of NATO, then there's no reason for Russia to invade Ukraine. No reason whatsoever. And that would have been a better outcome for Ukraine. Now we have the worst of all possible worlds. You have a Ukraine that is being very heavily destroyed. It's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to build up Ukraine again. And right now, the Western countries seem ready to pay for it. But when Western populations get tired of the cost of this war, and as you saw, the United States fought in Afghanistan for 20 years and then got tired and then left Afghanistan after 20 years. So if the West gets tired of Ukraine, the West will walk away from Ukraine and Ukraine will have a destroyed country. So the lesson from Ukraine, therefore, is never, ever allow yourself to be used in a proxy war against other powers. And Ukraine allowed itself to be used as a proxy war. And so that's why small states must study Ukraine very carefully. It's a sign that even a state, as I said, with 40 million people, surrounded by reasonably advanced societies like Germany, France, and all, can still suffer so much. So we have to learn, that's the big lesson. And we must therefore pay attention to the great powers that we are next to, and we must never appear to be hostile to the great powers who are our neighbors. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that you kowtow. You know, there is a big gap between hostility and kowtowing, right? You got to go somewhere in the middle. You be friendly, but independent. And you can sometimes very politely tell the great power, I don't agree with you on some things. We have a different policy. We will do things our own way. But all this requires good diplomacy. So that is the path that small states have to walk. Avoid hostility, avoid kowtowing to the great power. And Ukraine, unfortunately, got stuck in a position of hostility towards Russia. And so you ended up with this war. And this war was predicted in very precise terms by George Kennan 25 years ago, the greatest strategic thinker. And as you know, even Henry Kissinger, who's the greatest living strategic thinker in America, has said several times, Ukraine must not join NATO. Ukraine must not join NATO. Unfortunately, Kissinger's advice was also ignored. So when you ignore the advice of your great strategic thinkers like Kennan and Kissinger, you get a war like this. So we should study, you're right, we should study very, very carefully where Ukraine went wrong and make sure that we do not make the mistake that Ukraine has made.
Thank you, Professor. The Finance Minister has a question. Rimpo, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Director Swang and the Professor, for this very insightful afternoon talk. I am Namgit Singh, currently serving as the Finance Minister for the Royal Government of Bhutan. So, as I was listening to these insightful talks by the Professor, I'm equally concerned because something that usually goes unnoticed. So, case in point, Professor, you have mentioned that for a smaller state, we need to become increasingly paranoid, be more vigilant, and not to stretch our arms too much, and maintain the status quo kind of a position. So in this regard, elsewhere, not really referring to our context, but elsewhere in the world, what I have seen is that because of your vulnerability as in a small state, you tend to have an increasing vulnerability of yourself getting exposed the moment you are born, because I mean to say that you are influenced through an education, you are influenced by the kind of a culture. The only identity that the citizen of a small state will have is, for the case in Bhutan, we have a national uniform, a Goin Kira. So basically, actually, the smaller states tends to have that kind of the influence on us. The bigger states tends to have that kind of a small influence on the smaller states. So I think in the longer term, it will have a long-term bearing on the small states. So basically, how can we maneuver or draw a middle path so as to address that kind of an influence? Because in the long run, you tend to lose your identity. And on the other hand, we are saying that we need to have a very honest public servant, a pragmatic public servant, a meritocratic public servant. But on the other hand, since our education, you tends to be largely dependent on your neighboring state, and because of the matter of the fact that you are influenced since your kindergarten. So I think that will remain in your mind, and it's very difficult for us to make out and to change that particular person. So I think probably what I would like to ask to Professor here is that how can we be alert to maintain our identity, not physically but spiritually, mentally, and as a citizen of that particular country. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I think, by the way, you're absolutely right. Maintaining your different identity is very, very critical. Very critical. Because right now we live, as you know, in a very small globalized world. And a lot of foreign influences come into our country. And by the way, Singapore has a bigger problem than Bhutan. Much bigger problem. Because in Bhutan, you're lucky. You speak Bhutanese and you wear Bhutanese clothes, and you have a long history of Bhutanese identity. Singaporeans, we speak English. We wear, like me, I do, Western clothes. And we are very much a part of the Western world. So there is a very big danger that Singaporeans can think that they are mini Americans or mini British. And some Singaporeans actually think they're mini British and mini Americans. So it's very important to ensure that you preserve your identity and your difference. And in the case of Bhutan, I would say that if you want to change things, now is not the time to change. Because, you know, it's like when you're crossing a river, right? Some parts of the river are calm. Then you can change the captain or whatever it is of the ship. But some parts of the river or in the sea, you get a storm. And in the storm, you don't change your captain. You know, you stay in your chair and you protect the ship. So right now we are going through a big geopolitical storm, very big geopolitical storm. So it's very important that you try to preserve what you have, strengthen what you have, and strengthen your sense of national identity. Work harder on it, but work harder on it consciously. Do not assume that you will naturally become stronger. Have campaigns. Make a campaign to persuade people why their national identity is so important. Make them aware. Make them aware of their history, their culture, and so they do not become mini British or mini American. I say this, by the way, I'll give you a concrete example. You know, Hong Kong has a lot of problems, you know. I think you know that, right? And you know the reason why Hong Kong had problems, there are many reasons, but the Hong Kong education system was designed by the British. And after Hong Kong went back to China in 1997, the education system was still teaching young people in Hong Kong how to become good British citizens, right? And teaching them about British culture and nothing about Chinese culture, nothing. So you can see that because what was taught in the schools was a mistake. You ended up with problems between Hong Kong and China. So therefore, what you teach in the schools to the young people in Bhutan is very important, that you look very carefully at the textbook. What does the textbook say? Does it give them a sense of Bhutanese identity or some other identity? And I would say be aware when foreign influences come in and ensure they don't distort your identity. Now, this you're dealing in the world of intangibles, okay? And I can tell you, your fight is easier than the fight in Singapore. Singapore actually is still struggling to develop a deep sense of national identity. And of course, we are affected by the fact that we're not one race, 75% Chinese, 15% Malay Muslim, 6 to 8% Indian. So we're very multicultural. Plus we speak English and we wear Western clothes, and you cannot recognize a Singaporean from his clothes or from his, from his language. So therefore, it becomes very, very difficult for us to develop identity. But I can tell you, we're making good progress. Now, Singaporeans can, in some ways, intuitively recognize each other. Once they start speaking, there's a Singapore accent that's very clear. And they know each other. And they're overseas, you can recognize each other. So, so I would say you're absolutely right to point to the importance of strengthening the national identity, because I would say I can make a confident prediction that your sense of national identity will be threatened in the next 10 years. So you should be aware of that and preemptively try to strengthen it.
Thank you, Professor. I see the Minister for Labor and Human Resources. Limpo, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Professor. When you said that as a small state, we should be paranoid that wars can happen anytime and the prospect of war is very high. So when you said that, what crossed my mind was, what if China and India has a war? And how should we prepare, and what are the things we should be taking into stock? Because when you said that, that thing passed my mind and was a bit worried. Of course, I pray and wish this does not happen, but what if it happens? That was my first question. And on the second part, you said, as a small state, we have to be united, and the state should be together, but the population has to be united. So in a democratic setup, as you see, we have a lot of political parties. So it creates division. But although I recognize that in the national interest, as a country, as a people, we are together. But this democratic setup, when we have different parties, there seems to be division. And how do we sort this out, or what are the ways so that in the national interest, these things does not happen? These are the two questions I had. Thank you.
Well, they're very, very good questions. The first question, unfortunately, if India and China decide to go to war, you cannot do anything about it. Don't even try. What you should do is hide. Go under the table. That's what I would do. But at the same time, let me give you some good news. I had lunch recently with a very senior Indian diplomat. And I asked him, I said that, geopolitics, I must emphasize to all of you, if you think, if I come across as being very cold and brutal in my analysis, I must warn you all that geopolitics is a very cruel business, very cruel business. So in theory, the United States is supporting the freedom-fighting Ukrainians. That's the theory. What is the reality? The reality is that the United States is fulfilling a strategic goal of fighting the Russians right down to the last Ukrainian. So in the Cold War, as you know, the United States was very happy to fight the Soviet Union right down to the last Afghan. Today, the United States is happy to fight Russia right down to the last Ukrainian, because the United States loses nothing. It's weakening Russia with no resources. So at the same time, The other dream that United States has is to fight China right down to the last Indian. For United States, it'd be a dream come true if 1.3 billion Indians fight 1.4 billion Chinese. And so the senior Indian diplomat said to me, says, we also know this. We are not stupid. We know that United States wants to use Indians to fight Chinese, and we're not that stupid. We're not going to allow ourselves to be used for that. So I think, therefore, I think the prospects of an all-out war between India and China are less likely. You know, India is smart enough, and India also realizes that this is India's hour, right? India, in the next 10 years, the Indian economy is going to do very, very well. And it's a combination of various factors, okay? Many of the right investments have been made in India. Plus, India is the only major country that can predict who will be the next leader for the next 10 years. I can tell you that Modi will be in power for the next 10 years. And that creates political stability. And plus, the Indian people have demonstrated, both inside India and outside India, that they're very good entrepreneurs, right? So if they're among the major economies in the world, the two economies I'm the most bullish on are the Chinese economy and the Indian economy. So if the Indian government realizes that the next 10 years are going to be very good years for me, why do I want to get involved in a war with China? So for that reason, I think the war, therefore, between India and China is less likely. Now, your second question is a much harder question. You're right. Democracies create divisions. Democracies do not create unity. And so, therefore, Bhutan should be aware of that. And it should therefore ensure that among all the parties, they should agree that on 90% of the issues which involve Bhutan and Bhutanese security and Bhutanese prosperity, they should all agree on what needs to be done. And on the 10%, you can have a division. But if you have among the various political parties in Bhutan, only 10% agreement and 90% disagreement, then Bhutan is in trouble. So you must make sure that among all the political parties, there must be 90% agreement on the important issues. So on the important issues, you say, number one, on India, we stick with the status quo. On China, we stick with the status quo. For example, be very dangerous for a Bhutanese politician to stand up and say, we in Bhutan, we should cut off our diplomatic ties with India and establish diplomatic ties with China. Now, if a Bhutanese politician says that, he is committing national suicide for Bhutan. He shouldn't say that. There should be a 90% agreement on the status quo. No disagreement on that. So similarly, on keeping Bhutan honest and having an honest public service, there should be 90% agreement. We don't disagree on that. So on some fundamental policies, right, on identity, on language, don't change. So you must work out among all the parties the areas where you have 90% agreement and allow the disagreement only in 10%. Now, this will take a lot of effort, you know, a lot of effort. It won't happen automatically. But this can only happen if you're paranoid. That's why I suggest that Bhutan, like Singapore is very paranoid, by the way, should become very paranoid and ensure that if there are serious divisions coming up within Bhutan, to stop the divisions before they become serious. And this therefore, all political parties should meet and discuss what are the areas in which you agree, and then make sure that you agree on most of the important issues for Bhutan. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you, Professor. I see a couple of hands raised on the screen. Before we go to them, just a related question here on Slido. Professor, you said you don't see a prospect of full-blown war between India and China. Now, somebody here is asking, seeking your views as to how close could China and India get as a fallout of the drift in Indo-US relations because of the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Well, I don't see India and China moving closer together because there are, unfortunately, a lot of suspicions on both sides. And as you know, the border issue is unresolved. Although, if you look at the book by Professor Kanti Bajpai, Professor Kanti Bajpai, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, has written a book on China and India, small book. And in that book, he quotes me. And what I say in his book is that a Chinese diplomat told me that whenever the India and Chinese meet for border negotiations, the Indian diplomats would say to the Chinese diplomats, they say when Premier Zhou Enlai came to India, he proposed that we accept the existing line of control within China and India. When Mr. Deng Xiaoping met Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, he proposed that we accept the line of control. So the Indians tell the Chinese, why don't you propose it to us again? Accept the line of control. And the Chinese reply, you know what the Chinese reply? The Chinese reply is, why didn't you accept it then? Why didn't India accept that proposal first? So right now, the good news, this I'm giving you as the good news, privately, all the Chinese leaders know, and all the Indian leaders know that the border will be settled on the existing line of control, right? China is not going to give up Aksai Chin back to India. India will not give Arunachal Pradesh to China. There's no question, they'll keep their territories. So therefore, there is that possibility of an agreement, but that requires strong leaders in China and India, which I think possibly can happen in the next 5 to 10 years. But so because both sides are realistic enough about the border issues, I actually think that the prospects of war are low, but the suspicions will remain within China and India. And because the suspicions will remain within China and India, Bhutan must be very careful in this particular area. This is the most dangerous area for Bhutan, which is the relationship between India and China.
Thank you, Professor. We have 3 hands up on the screen. So let those be.
Shall I answer all 3 questions since we have to finish in 5 or 10 minutes?
Yes, Professor. I think that will
why don't you give me, I'll take notes of the 3 questions and then I'll answer all of them. Yeah. Because we have to finish.
They are on screen, so I'll invite them to ask you directly, Professor. So,
sure. I'll take the 3 questions. Yeah.
The Education Minister, Lembu, would you like to go first?
Yes, good afternoon, Professor.
Good afternoon.
As I was, in fact, I also watch your YouTube a lot, and also as I also following up closely Ukraine war for last almost 100 days. Many of the great thinkers were discussing about the new world. Now the world is no more as it used to be, but then now it has changed. Of course, it has changed a lot. The COVID has changed. Now Ukraine war and other things are changing the whole scenario of the world, the new world. Basically, what they were discussing was very interesting things. So far, the focus we're going towards investment, thinking, we're moving towards saving the planet through environment, investment on environment, investment on education, investment on health, investment on productive technologies, future technologies, and all those things. But now they all the discussion has been now transforming towards now investment is going to move from education, health, environment, other things to tanks, then destructive technologies, war technologies, and so-called security technologies. Now, in such scenario, now I as a education minister, now also education minister, now invest. Now, if that's the way of the world moving towards that, now small countries like us, like Bhutan, Singapore, and many of our countries, and also developing countries like Bhutan, many of our investment on in education, health, and many of the environmental things come from even donor countries. So in such scenario now, where the fate and the future lies of such small countries like us, Professor? Thank you.
We will also have the questions from Director Jigme and then Madam Sonam.
Lars, thank you, Tasho. I have two quick questions. Professor, you mentioned about the dangers of populism. And I was also looking at how Singapore has been able to achieve, such success without actually going into, populist agendas. And you mentioned how the politicians were able to, give very candid suggestions to the public, and yet be able to continue remaining in power. So my query was, firstly, such an enlightened, voter base, looking at the level of education or the quality of education. It looks like in the early 70s, Singapore did have issues even with the quality of education. I was just wondering, was it the enlightened voters, or did you have institutions, that helped Singapore navigate the challenges of democracy, as you highlighted? The other question I had is with regard to even if we achieve MPH, as you very articulate, you put it very well. I'm just wondering, as a small state, there are a lot of dangers. For example, one emerging threat is the impact of technology, particularly with regard to the impact of social media, artificial intelligence, reinforcing biases, reinforcing divisive ideologies. And as a small state, we do not have control over these things. In your view, what can small states do to counteract such things? I mean, fake news is just something off the top of my head. Thank you, Professor.
Last, Director Sonam, good to have you ask the last question.
Thank you, Tasho. Thank you, Professor. A couple of months ago, I was listening to a lecture by the Honorable Prime Minister, Singapore. He delivered it to SMU in 2015. And it was basically talking about the challenges for Singapore. And he eloquently articulated that in the next 10 years, the biggest challenge would be the economy. And in the next 25 years, it would be the population. And in the long run, in 50 years, the biggest challenge for Singapore would be identity. So I just wanted to know that being small states, would these challenges be similar for Bhutan? But at the same time, I'm also aware that Bhutan is a developing country. And when I look at it right now, Bhutan, we have a very strong identity. But also, if you look at it, if you need to have a very strong economy or economic development, you need to loosen a bit in terms of your conservation, policies. And for example, opening your doors towards migrant workers, and then also being very open to infusion of global ideas and trends. But at the same time, now, if you have these things, then it is going to impede on your identity in the long run. So I was just wondering, how do you strike a balance in these type of challenges that are there? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Those are all excellent questions. I'll try to respond to them as quickly as possible, because I know we have exceeded our time already. On the first question from the Minister of Education about the world investing in productive technologies and destructive technologies, I completely agree with that. And I would say there's one important lesson I learned in life, that in every crisis, there's an opportunity. So in the current world, there is one big opportunity for Bhutan in the field of technology. As you know, the world is very worried about climate change. And lots of people give speeches about climate change. But very few people can do something about climate change. So I would say Bhutan, because of its, Bhutan is very blessed. There's good forests. You haven't overdeveloped. You haven't destroyed your forests and so on and so forth. So you can invest in technologies that help Bhutan fight climate change and help the world fight climate change, So just as you know, Bhutan became famous for the gross happiness index. In the same way, Bhutan can also become famous for having invested in technologies that help to fight climate change, and therefore you raise Bhutan's standing in the world. So people look up to Bhutan. And in that sense, it creates a positive sense of self-esteem. And Bhutan has an advantage that you don't have to worry about buying tanks or aircraft and all that. You don't need all of that. Because you don't have a neighboring country that is about your size that you're going to fight with. So Bhutan has got that freedom, and so I would use that freedom to invest in the productive technologies in the fight against climate change, and therefore position yourself globally as being at the forefront in the fight there. Now, in the second question from Jigme Tenzing, why did Singapore succeed in fighting off populism? I would say there are at least three reasons. One, we had exceptional leaders, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam. And then, of course, we had the right policies of development also. But at the same time, one other small thing that Singapore did, which I don't know whether Bhutan does, Singapore and Australia are two countries, very few countries, that have compulsory voting. So we make every citizen vote. You must vote. It's compulsory. And the advantage of that is that if everybody votes, you get more common sense among a bigger population. Whereas if you only have small groups voting, the small groups have only one cause, and they focus only on their one cause, and that's how you get populism also. So that's one small change you can try to do, have compulsory voting and make everybody vote, and therefore then you get less danger of populism coming into play, because if you have more people there, you get a balance of views among more people, rather than have a small group voting thing. Now, the second question about the social media is a difficult one, especially the question about fake news. But Singapore has set up laws against fake news. And I would encourage you to study the laws of Singapore. And so we are actually prosecuting and also successfully convicting people who spread fake news. And we have designed laws for that. So I think those laws can be used, and Bhutan can learn some lessons from our laws. And of course, the Western states will not do this, but the Western states, I think, are in a different universe from us Asian states. And we should learn from each other rather than learn from the West in this area. And finally, to respond to Ms. Sonam, yeah, I mean, I think I agree with our PM's views that for Singapore, the long run question is, long run challenge is identity. I don't think that's the long run challenge for Bhutan, because your sense of identity, as I keep emphasizing, is stronger than the Singaporean sense of identity. But at the same time, you're right that Bhutan can develop its economy faster by importing migrant workers, importing global ideas, but also be very, very careful. Because migrant workers are a double-edged sword. They boost your economy, but they can also generate local resentment. And you know, the reason why the People's Action Party, the ruling party of Singapore, did badly in the 2011 elections 11 years ago was because the Singapore government brought in too many migrant workers too fast. And there was a backlash because people didn't want their lives to be disrupted. And Singapore is a very small country, much smaller than Bhutan, by the way. So we made a mistake. And similarly, when it comes to importing global ideas, also be careful. Because many of the Western ideas, and I want to say this very bluntly to you, that many of the Western ideas are wrong and stupid. And unfortunately, they control the global media. They control the New York Times. They control the Washington Post. They control the Wall Street Journal. They control the Financial Times. They control the Economist. But I can tell you, these magazines have terrible ideas, wrong ideas, even for their own people. But, you know, that's their problem. But we must not import their ideas. And I would say for a country like Bhutan, if you are trying to preserve your identity, your biggest threat to Bhutanese identity is going to come from Western ideas that are designed for Western situation and not designed for the Asian situation. So you must have the political and cultural courage to reject Western ideas. And that's what Singapore has done quite a bit. Singapore has got the political and intellectual and cultural courage to reject Western ideas. And I would encourage Bhutan to do the same also and keep our Asian identities safe from some of these dangerous Western ideas. I hope I've responded to all the questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. On that note, we come to the end of this wonderful session with Professor Mahbubani. My apologies to those of you whose questions I could not take with Professor because he has an engagement coming up at 4 o'clock. I wish this conversation can go on, but like any other good thing, this too should come to an end. So I now hand over to RIGSS Research Officer Lily Yangchin to say a few closing remarks. Thank you.
Honorable Prime Minister, Ministers, Secretaries, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. As we come to the end of today's insightful and timely lecture by Professor Mahbubani, we're left with much to think about how small states can indeed survive with their soft powers, strategic policies, and strengthened preparedness. At RIGSS, we work to promote a culture of lifelong learning, and platforms like the Friday Forum, which is the Institute's flagship public lecture series, provide us this opportunity to enhance our intellectual growth. Among others, the lecture today has demonstrated why we must discuss such topics and contextualize them within the Bhutanese understanding against the backdrop of the recent global developments and the current national reforms taking place. For this, we're truly grateful to Professor for sharing your profound ideas with such precision and clarity and prompting us to think critically about our small states' vulnerability, national unity, and the need for a strong civil service institution. As rightly phrased by Professor in your book, The Asian 21st Century, and re-emphasized during the second part of today's lecture, we are witnessing a, quote, rapid shrinkage of the world through both technological leaps and growing interdependence. The interconnected nature of our existence is becoming ever more defined and discernible in our world today. Hence, it is pertinent for small states like ours to stay informed and alert about what is happening around us and how these events would inevitably affect us both directly and indirectly. We are humbled to have Professor back with us again at RIGSS, albeit virtually, for our first Friday forum since the pandemic. We cannot think of a more renowned scholar to grace our revamped Friday forum this afternoon. And so, on behalf of RIGSS, the participants, and the guests gathered here today, I would like to sincerely thank Professor Kishore Mahbubani for delivering a thought-provoking lecture and illuminating us with your vast knowledge, wisdom, and expertise on issues of international interest and importance. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Honorable Prime Minister, ministers, and distinguished guests for taking time off your busy schedules to be a part of this event today. And our deepest gratitude to the participants joining us from both within and outside Bhutan. We are overwhelmed by the support and enthusiasm that you have demonstrated, especially for our Friday forum, which only encourages us to bring more such eminent speakers to you in the future. We hope to see you again soon. Until then, please continue to reflect upon these insights from this lecture so that the conversations that have just begun today may go on. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.